The laughter beyond the veil. In the year 2157, Earth had become a patchwork of gleaming megacities and vast wastelands. Humanity had clawed its way into the stars, colonizing moons and planets. But the heart of its civilization remained a labyrinth of technological marvels and social rot. Beneath the shining spires, where neon lights painted the night skies in nauseating hues, an ancient, unexplainable darkness stirred. The story began in New Helix, the largest city on Earth. Its streets were a chaotic dance of autonomous drones, wandering holograms, and the occasional flesh-and-blood human trudging through their banal existence. Among them was Quentin Voss, a former stand-up comedian turned corporate drudge. Quentin had once been a rising star, his dark humor a perfect match for the bleakness of modern times. But one night, on the cusp of his big break, he had made a joke that caused the room to fall eerily silent. He couldn't remember the punchline, just the laughter. Not the audience's laughter, but something deeper, more guttural, and inhuman. Since that night, his career had spiraled into oblivion. His memories of the event were hazy, fractured, and dreamlike, but one thing was clear: something had laughed back. By day, Quentin slogged through his job as a data optimist, a euphemism for a position so meaningless it defied description. By night, he spiraled into insomnia, haunted by flashes of that forgotten punchline and the laughter that followed. His life had become a grotesque routine until he received a cryptic message on his neural implant, a message that didn't belong to any network he knew. "Knock, knock," it said. His breath hitched. It wasn't text. It was sound, the distorted, warped echo of his own voice. He tried to delete it, but it wouldn't go away. Instead, it repeated, growing louder and more warped until he unplugged his neural link in a panic. For the first time in years, Quentin left his apartment, a decrepit studio in a tower of endless corridors and flickering lights. As he wandered the city, Quentin felt the streets pulse with an energy he couldn't place. The world seemed wrong. The angles of buildings bent in subtle but impossible ways. The chatter of people on the streets was filled with words that dissolved the moment he tried to focus on them. Even the air smelled off, a sharp, metallic tang beneath the city's usual pollution. Then he saw her. She was sitting alone in a dilapidated comedy club tucked into the shadow of a megastructure. The neon sign above flickered violently, spelling gestures hollow when it wasn't buzzing incoherently. The woman's face was obscured by a heavy veil, her posture unnervingly still. Something about her felt familiar, like the distant echo of a dream. Quentin felt compelled to enter. Inside, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sweetly cloying, like rotting fruit. The stage was empty except for a lone microphone. The woman was the only patron, her veil shimmering in the dim light. "Welcome back," she said, her voice resonating with a strange echo. Quentin froze. The sound was both comforting and horrifying, like a mother calling her child from the bottom of a deep well. "Do I know you?" Quentin stammered. "You tell the joke. I laugh. That's how it works, Quentin." Her words triggered something deep in his mind. The forgotten punchline surged to the forefront, vivid and alive. But every time he tried to recall the details, his thoughts unraveled like a thread pulled too tight. "I don't understand," he said, backing toward the exit. But the door was gone. The walls of the club twisted and coiled like the ribs of a giant beast. The woman stood, and the veil slipped from her face. Quentin screamed. Her face was a void, not the absence of features, but the absence of anything, a hollow, cosmic emptiness that seemed to suck the air from the room. Her laughter followed, a cascading chorus of tones that didn't belong to any human throat. Quentin bolted for the stage, his instincts screaming that the microphone was the key. As he grabbed it, the world fractured like a pane of glass struck by a hammer. The laughter followed him, warping reality into a kaleidoscope of surreal horrors. Quentin awoke in his apartment, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, the walls solid, but his neural implant buzzed incessantly. A new message had arrived. "The setup is complete. Ready for the punchline?" Quentin tried to laugh, but it came out as a choked sob. He couldn't shake the feeling that something vast and unknowable was watching him, waiting for him to tell the joke again. Only this time, the punchline might be his life or his sanity. The city outside grew stranger with each passing day. People began to vanish without explanation, leaving behind only echoes of laughter that lingered in the air like a haunting melody. Quentin, desperate for answers, found himself drawn to the depths of New Helix, to forgotten districts where reality seemed to thin. He encountered others like him, strangers who spoke in riddles and laughed at jokes that hadn't been told. They all shared the same haunted look, their eyes flickering with the light of distant stars. "You heard it, didn't you?" one of them whispered in an alleyway, his face half melted, as though reality couldn't hold him together. "The laughter." Quentin nodded, his throat dry. "What is it?" The man's laughter cracked like thunder. "You'll find out when it's your turn to punch." The veil between worlds continued to thin. Quentin's reflection in mirrors started to linger too long, grinning long after he turned away. The city's geometry grew more alien, its streets looping back on themselves in impossible ways. And everywhere, always, was the sound of laughter, echoing, mocking, unrelenting. Finally, Quentin found himself back at Jester's Hollow. The neon sign now read, "Final Performance." Inside, the veiled woman waited, her faceless void more oppressive than ever. The microphone stood on the stage, its cord snaking into an abyss that pulsed with the sound of faint chuckling. "Tell the joke," she whispered. Quentin stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling. The punchline was on the tip of his tongue, a jagged shard of memory slicing through his mind. He opened his mouth, and the world held its breath. Quentin stood under the flickering spotlight, the microphone crackling faintly in his grip. His heart pounded like a drumbeat, but beneath the terror was a strange, insidious clarity. The joke, the one he buried deep in the recesses of his mind, was surfacing unbidden. He looked out into the audience. The veiled woman was no longer alone. Shadowy figures filled the seats, their forms rippling like oil on water. They didn't have faces, just suggestions of eyes and mouths that gaped too wide. Their attention was suffocating, a silent demand pressing against his skull. He tried to laugh, to diffuse the dread swelling in his chest, but the sound came out thin and brittle. The punchline pressed harder, demanding to be released. What do you call a comedian?" he began, the words forming without his consent. His voice cracked, and the figures in the audience leaned forward as one, their shapes blurring like static. Who finally gets the last laugh? The silence that followed was absolute. Time itself seemed to stop. Quentin's pulse roared in his ears, and he felt a pressure building in his chest, as if the entire universe was compressing into a single moment. Then, the laughter erupted. It was deafening, a chorus of thousands, maybe millions of voices cascading through the room. The shadows in the audience convulsed, their forms stretching and warping in grotesque ecstasy. The veiled woman's void-like face began to unravel, threads of darkness spilling out and snaking toward him. Quentin dropped the microphone and tried to run, but the laughter followed, pounding against his mind like a sledgehammer. He bolted through the club's twisting corridors, the architecture shifting and folding around him. The walls oozed a viscous black substance that reeked of decay. Doors appeared and vanished in the periphery of his vision, and every one he tried led to more impossible hallways. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, as though reality itself was breaking apart. He stumbled into a room that shouldn't have existed, a sprawling chamber of endless mirrors. Each reflected him, but not as he was now. They showed him older, younger, mutilated, and smiling with teeth that didn't belong to him. In one mirror, his reflection stepped forward, pressing its hand against the glass. Quentin froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Do you get it yet?" the reflection asked, its grin splitting its face unnaturally wide. The mirrors shattered simultaneously, and Quentin fell to his knees, his ears ringing with the sound. He was no longer in the club. He was somewhere else. The ground beneath him was slick and pulsating, like living flesh. The air was heavy with a foul, sweet odor, and the sky, if it was a sky, was a swirling maelstrom of colors that defied logic. Figures moved in the distance, their shapes impossible to discern. They seemed to glide rather than walk, their movements jerky and wrong. Quentin's instinct screamed to run, but he had no idea where he could go. This place wasn't meant for him. Above him, the swirling sky seemed to part, revealing an immense, yawning void. From it came a voice, a deep, resonant tone that shook the very ground. "Do you understand the joke, Quentin?" "I don't know," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I don't know what you want." The void pulsed, and the laughter returned, more oppressive than ever. It wasn't just sound. It was a force, a presence that tore at the edges of his sanity. "You told the joke, but you never listened to the punchline." Quentin dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The words from the void clawed at his mind, dragging memories he didn't recognize to the surface. Flashes of impossible images assaulted him. Worlds consumed by shadow, faces stretched into hideous parodies of joy, and himself, standing on an endless stage, laughing as reality crumbled around him. He looked up, and the veiled woman was there, her form towering and otherworldly. She extended a hand, long and clawed, and pressed it to his chest. A surge of pain shot through him as she spoke. "Your existence is the setup, Quentin. The punchline is everything else." With that, she drove her hand into his chest, and Quentin screamed as his body dissolved into a cascade of black, inky tendrils. He felt himself unraveling, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. When he awoke, Quentin was back in his apartment. The city outside was silent, too silent. The usual hum of drones, chatter of pedestrians, and distant sirens were gone. He stumbled to the window and looked out. The city was still there, but it was wrong. The buildings twisted in impossible spirals, their surfaces rippling like water. The streets were empty, save for faint, flickering shadows that seemed to laugh as they moved. The sky was a swirling void, and in its center, an enormous eye watched him, unblinking. Quentin sank to the floor, his mind a fractured mess. He could still hear the laughter, faint but constant, echoing in the back of his skull. His neural implant buzzed again, displaying a single message. "The audience loved your performance. Encore." He stared at the words, tears streaming down his face. He understood now. He was trapped, a puppet in some cosmic joke that had no end. The punchline wasn't his escape, it was his prison. And somewhere, in the depths of that laughter, Quentin laughed too. Quentin's laughter began as a weak, gasping chuckle. He clutched at his chest, the sound bubbling up involuntarily, like a hiccup born of despair. But as the message on his neural implant pulsed, as the flickering shadows outside his window twisted and danced in mockery, his laughter grew. It swelled uncontrollable, tearing through his throat until it echoed through the empty corridors of his apartment complex. The laughter wasn't his anymore. It had taken on a life of its own, crawling from his mouth like an unseen parasite, infecting the air. His vision blurred, the room around him shifting as though he were submerged underwater. Somewhere in the chaos of his mind, a memory surfaced, a fragment from years ago, long before the joke, before the darkness. He had been a child, sitting in the dim living room of his childhood home, watching an old comedy show with his father. The comedian on the screen had been a gaudy caricature, his jokes predictable, his movements exaggerated for cheap laughs. But Quentin's father had laughed, loud and genuine, his booming voice filling the room. "See, kid," his father had said, ruffling his hair. "It's not about being clever. It's about knowing your audience." The memory dissolved, replaced by the sound of an applause track, a tinny, distorted loop playing somewhere in his apartment. Quentin turned, his laughter finally subsiding, and saw his television had switched on. Static filled the screen, broken occasionally by flashes of something indistinct. Shapes, faces, and scenes that his brain couldn't fully comprehend. Then the static cleared. On the screen was Quentin himself, standing on a stage identical to the one in Jester's Hollow. The version of him on the screen grinned, teeth far too white, far too sharp. "Knock, knock," the Quentin on the screen said, his voice warped and hollow. Quentin backed away from the television, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "No more." "Knock, knock." The screen Quentin repeated louder this time. His grin widened impossibly, splitting his face into a grotesque rictus. "I'm not answering," Quentin screamed, clutching at his temples as the television began to buzz and crackle. The static returned, filling the room with a piercing whine. The shadows outside his window pressed against the glass, their laughter now a cacophony. Quentin stumbled into the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. He locked it, though some part of him knew it was futile. The mirror above the sink caught his reflection, and he flinched. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, but it wasn't that which sent a shiver down his spine. His reflection wasn't moving. It stared at him, motionless, as though frozen in time. Then it smiled, the same impossibly wide grin from the television. "Who's there?" his reflection whispered, its voice crawling up from the drain beneath the sink. Quentin stumbled back, his heel catching on the bath mat, sending him sprawling to the floor. The mirror cracked, a jagged line splitting his reflection in two. From the fissure leaked a black, viscous substance that dripped into the sink, hissing as it hit the porcelain. The walls of the bathroom began to shift. The tiles warped and stretched, their surfaces pulsating like living tissue. The door behind Quentin melted into the wall, leaving him trapped in the small, claustrophobic space. "Who's there?" the reflection repeated, its voice louder now, overlapping itself in layers like a choir of mocking tones. Quentin scrambled to his feet, his back pressed against the living wall. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The mirror exploded outward, shards of glass raining down on him. From the jagged hole stepped something that had been pretending to be his reflection. It stood tall and thin, its limbs stretched and angular, its skin an ashen gray that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Its face was a void, a swirling darkness that sucked in the light around it. Quentin froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure cocked its head, as though studying him. "Why do you run, Quentin?" it asked, its voice a guttural, resonant hum. "The joke isn't over." The room twisted again, reality folding in on itself. Quentin fell through the floor, tumbling into an abyss of light and sound. He landed hard on a stage, the spotlight blinding him as the applause erupted from an unseen audience. He was back on the stage, the microphone waiting for him like an executioner's blade. The veiled woman stood in the wings, her faceless void radiating anticipation. "Encore, Quentin," she said. "They're waiting." The audience's laughter grew louder, their voices merging into a singular roar that vibrated through his bones. Quentin stared at the microphone, his hands trembling. He wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but there was no escape. The punchline was coming. It always had been. Quentin stepped forward, his mind numb, his body moving as though it belonged to someone else. He took the microphone in his hand, its surface cold and slick. He stared out at the audience, at the flickering shadows, the impossible shapes, the faces that melted and reformed. And he began to speak. Quentin's voice cracked as he started, barely audible over the roiling sea of laughter that surged from the shadows. The words tumbled out of his mouth, unbidden and alien, as though some ancient force had seized control of his tongue. He didn't understand what he was saying. It wasn't English or any language he knew, but the cadence was unmistakable, a rhythm that clawed its way into the ears of his unseen audience. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any sound. It pressed against Quentin's chest, filling the room with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself had curdled. He glanced at the veiled woman in the wings. Her head tilted slightly, a gesture that might have been approval, or something far darker. Then, the shadows began to move. The figures in the audience rose from their seats, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though their bodies resisted the commands of gravity. Their shapes shifted with every step, one moment humanoid, the next grotesque parodies of form. Limbs stretched and retracted. Faces split and merged. Eyes multiplied and vanished. "Keep going," the veiled woman's voice echoed, though her mouth, or what passed for one, did not move. Quentin's grip on the microphone tightened. He didn't know what would happen if he stopped, but the fear of finding out was stronger than his urge to flee. His voice rose, the alien words growing faster, more forceful. They twisted in his throat, sharp and guttural, leaving behind a metallic taste. The audience reached the edge of the stage. Up close, they were even more horrifying. Empty eye sockets dripping with black ichor, mouths filled with spiraling rows of jagged teeth. Their laughter no longer a sound, but a vibration that rattled Quentin's skull. One of the figures climbed onto the stage, its legs bending backward like a spider's. It loomed over Quentin, its form flickering in and out of existence. A hand, if it could be called that, reached for him, the fingers elongating into thin, razor-sharp tendrils. "Tell it," the figure hissed, its voice 1,000 whispers layered together. Quentin stumbled back, his words faltering for the first time. The figure froze, its head snapping to the side in a grotesque imitation of curiosity. "You can't stop now," the veiled woman warned. "Do you want to disappoint them?" The audience's laughter resumed, louder and more aggressive, like a wave crashing against the walls of his sanity. The figures on the stage pressed closer, their forms merging into a single mass of writhing shadows. Quentin closed his eyes, trying to shut it all out, but the words still came. They poured from him in an unending torrent, carving deep grooves into his psyche. He wasn't speaking anymore. He was unraveling. Reality fractured. The stage dissolved into a swirling void, and Quentin was falling again, tumbling through endless darkness. The laughter followed him, a relentless tide that stripped away pieces of his identity. Memories surfaced and disintegrated. His first comedy set, his mother's voice, the taste of cheap beer on a rainy night. They were pulled apart, shredded into meaningless fragments, and then he stopped falling. Quentin found himself in a vast, empty expanse. The ground was smooth and featureless, stretching infinitely in every direction. The sky, or what passed for it, was a pulsating mass of shifting colors, like oil on water. In the distance, a single figure stood. It was himself. The other Quentin was smiling, his face eerily calm. "Tough crowd, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with dark humor. Quentin took a cautious step forward. "What is this? What's happening to me?" "You're finally in on the joke," the other Quentin replied, his grin widening. "But the punchline? That's where it gets good." "I don't understand," Quentin said, his voice trembling. "What joke? What punchline?" The other Quentin gestured to the void around them. "This. All of this. You thought you were just some guy grinding through life trying to make people laugh. But you were always part of something bigger. A setup. A setup for what?" Quentin demanded. The other Quentin leaned in, his smile now impossibly wide. "For them." The shadows erupted from the ground, spiraling upward like black flames. They surrounded Quentin, their laughter deafening. Faces formed in the darkness, each one a distorted version of his own, mocking him with toothy grins and hollow eyes. The other Quentin stepped back, his body dissolving into the void. "You're the punchline, buddy," he said, his voice fading. "And they've been waiting a long time for this." The shadows closed in, and Quentin screamed. When the void finally subsided, Quentin was back on the stage. The audience was gone, the seats empty. The veiled woman stood before him, her form no longer shifting. She was solid now, her presence overwhelming. "You performed admirably," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "The joke is complete." Quentin dropped the microphone, his body trembling. What happens now?" The veiled woman reached out, her hand impossibly large, and touched his forehead. "Now, you become part of it." The laughter returned, louder and more horrifying than ever, as Quentin's vision faded. He felt himself being pulled apart, his essence dissolving into the cosmic fabric of the joke. And somewhere, in the infinite void, the punchline echoed. The darkness consumed Quentin utterly, swallowing him whole, but his consciousness didn't end. It stretched and twisted, pulled apart like taffy, yet somehow still intact. He became aware of motion, a sensation of being carried on a tide of chaotic energy. The laughter was no longer external. It was inside him now, reverberating through the very essence of his being. And then, he was the laughter. Quentin's awareness expanded, no longer confined to a body, a mind, or even a single point in space. He could see everything, everywhere, all at once. A sprawling, incomprehensible network of realities, threads of existence woven together in patterns that defied logic. Each thread was a joke, a cosmic setup. Each punchline was devastation. He understood now. The universe wasn't governed by laws or order, but by an ancient, infinite sense of humor. And the joke was cruel. In one reality, Quentin saw a woman tearfully reunite with a lost loved one, only for both to be consumed by a sudden rift in space-time. In another, a planet celebrated its first contact with extraterrestrial life, only for the visitors to release spores that dissolved every living creature into dust. Over and over, Quentin saw these moments, the punchlines arriving in twisted, ironic splendor. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. He had no mouth, no form, no identity. He was a fragment of something larger now, a cog in the machine of cosmic absurdity. Somewhere in the infinite expanse, he became aware of them, the audience. They weren't shadows anymore. They were entities, vast and incomprehensible, their forms stretching across dimensions. They weren't watching him. They were watching through him. He was their window into existence, their channel for entertainment. One of the entities noticed him. Its form coalesced into something Quentin could almost comprehend, a grotesque face, its features exaggerated to a cartoonish degree. It leaned closer, its laughter shaking the fabric of reality. "Good show, kid," it said, its voice a cacophony of tones and frequencies. But the thing about a good joke? It never really ends. Quentin was hurled back into form, spat out into a world that wasn't his own. He was standing on a street he didn't recognize, under a sky that pulsed with faint, unnatural colors. The buildings around him were alive, their surfaces shifting like breathing skin. People walked the streets, if they could still be called people. Their faces were contorted into permanent, grotesque smiles, their bodies bent and warped in impossible ways. They laughed as they moved, their voices hollow and joyless. Quentin realized he was laughing too. His body felt foreign, his movements stiff and automated, like a puppet on strings. He tried to stop, but the laughter wouldn't leave him. It poured from his throat in an unending stream, his voice blending with the cacophony of the others. He stumbled to a reflective surface, a window, maybe, or something pretending to be one, and saw his face. It wasn't his anymore. His mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin, his eyes black pits that glimmered faintly with the light of distant stars. He was one of them now, one of the punchlines. Time passed, or perhaps it didn't. Days and nights blurred together, the world around him looping in a surreal, unending cycle. He wandered the streets, his mind a fractured mess, bits of himself slipping away with every step. Sometimes he'd hear whispers in the laughter, faint echoes of other trapped souls, fragments of jokes they'd told, regrets they'd carried. Occasionally, Quentin saw cracks in the world. Through them, he glimpsed other places, other people. He saw a woman on a stage, a microphone in her hand, her face a mask of terror. He saw a man in a sterile, white room, screaming as shadowy figures closed in. He saw a child alone in a dark forest, laughing hysterically as trees bent and twisted toward her. Every crack was another setup, another punchline waiting to be delivered. Quentin eventually found himself drawn back to a familiar place, a dilapidated comedy club tucked into the folds of the shifting city. The sign above the door still read "Jester's Hollow," though the letters now writhed and rearranged themselves, forming nonsensical phrases. Inside, the stage waited, bathed in a sickly green light. The microphone stood at the center, its cords snaking into the darkness. Quentin felt an irresistible pull, his body moving toward it against his will. The audience was there, their forms shifting and flickering, Their laughter swelled as he approached the stage, a sound that scraped against the walls of his mind. Quentin stepped up to the microphone. He didn't want to. Every part of him screamed to run, to resist, but the cosmic joke was stronger than his will. He took the microphone in his hand and opened his mouth. The joke came out. The laughter followed. Somewhere, in the infinite vastness of the cosmos, the entities watched. They reveled in the absurdity, the tragedy, the endless cycle of setup and punchline. Quentin was theirs now, his existence a tool for their cruel amusement. And the joke continued forever. Quentin's voice echoed through the comedy club, the joke spilling from his lips like a curse. It wasn't funny, not in the conventional sense. It wasn't even coherent. It was a jagged stream of words that bent reality itself, a linguistic black hole drawing everything toward its center. The audience laughed, not joyously, but ravenously, like predators circling prey. Quentin felt his mind stretch, fray, and teeter on the brink of dissolution. But something stopped him from falling completely. A faint thread of defiance sparked in his core, a fragment of himself that refused to succumb to the punchline. He had been the setup, he had been the punchline. But now, as he stood on the stage, surrounded by the twisted forms of the audience, a realization gripped him. What if the joke could end? The veiled woman appeared again, her towering form solidifying at the edge of the stage. Her faceless void radiated satisfaction, but it flickered slightly as if something had disturbed her usual composure. "You've done well, Quentin," she said, her voice reverberating like a chorus of whispers. "The audience is pleased. The cycle continues." Quentin turned to face her, gripping the microphone tightly. For the first time, he saw her clearly, not just the faceless avatar she presented, but what lay behind it. Her form wasn't a woman at all, but a swirling maelstrom of cosmic threads, interwoven strands of countless lives and worlds, each vibrating with the laughter of the damned. "You're the joke too," Quentin said, his voice trembling but firm. The veiled woman tilted her head, the void of her face darkening. "What are you trying to say?" "You're just another part of the setup," he continued, his words taking on a life of their own. A punchline in someone else's joke. The laughter in the room faltered, stuttering like a needle skipping on a record. The audience shifted, their forms flickering with uncertainty. For a brief moment, the oppressive weight of their attention lifted. Quentin seized the opportunity. He stepped closer to the veiled woman, his gaze locked onto the swirling threads that composed her form. "You think you're in control," he said. "You think you're the one laughing. But what if you're not? What if this whole thing, this stage, this audience, even you, what if it's all someone else's setup?" The veiled woman's void-like face rippled, her form trembling. "You don't understand the scope of this joke," she hissed, her voice losing its composure. "You are nothing but a fragment, a speck in the grand design." "Maybe," Quentin said, a faint, grim smile forming on his lips. "But every joke falls apart when the audience realizes it's being played." The room shook violently, the laughter turning to static. The audience figures began to unravel, their grotesque forms dissolving into streams of black ichor. The veiled woman staggered, her towering presence shrinking as Quentin's words pierced her being. Quentin turned back to the microphone, his mind racing. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing, only that he had to keep going. He leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and deliberate. "Here's the thing about a good joke," he said, his tone laced with dark defiance. "It only works if you don't know the punchline. But now, I think we've all heard it." The room cracked like shattered glass. The oppressive weight of the audience's gaze vanished entirely, replaced by a growing void that consumed the stage, the club, and everything within. The veiled woman screamed, her voice distorted and alien, as her form splintered into shards of light. "You can't stop it," she cried, her voice fading into the void. "The laughter never ends." Quentin smiled faintly as the world dissolved around him. "Maybe not," he said, "but it doesn't mean I have to stay for the encore." The void swallowed him, but this time, it didn't feel like annihilation. It felt like release. Quentin drifted through the endless expanse, his form no longer bound by flesh or thought. He was weightless, untethered, and free. For the first time, he felt no laughter, no oppressive presence, no cruel punchline waiting to drop. There was only silence, and in that silence, he heard something else, a faint, distant sound. It wasn't laughter or mocking applause. It was a whisper, soft and tentative like the first notes of a song. Hope. When Quentin finally opened his eyes, he was somewhere new. The sky above him was vast and unbroken, a deep, endless blue. The ground beneath him was solid and warm, covered in soft grass that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were no towering buildings, no twisted shadows, no veiled figures lurking in the corners. He wasn't sure if this was another world, another reality, or simply a construct of his own mind. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Quentin felt whole. He sat down in the grass, letting the breeze wash over him. A faint smile touched his lips as he closed his eyes. The weight of countless punchlines finally lifted from his soul. The joke was over, and Quentin Voss, former comedian, eternal punchline, was free.